You wake up and something is wrong. Your throat feels like gravel. Your joints ache with a specific misery that tells you this is not a bad night's sleep. This is something else. You reach for your phone. You scroll through your symptoms. You order medicine or book a same-day appointment, or at worst, drag yourself to an urgent care clinic and wait an hour surrounded by strangers with their own private disasters. Now take all of that away. No phone. No clinic. No pharmacist behind a counter who can answer questions without judgment. No clear understanding of what a germ even is. The year is somewhere around 1100. You are a peasant in rural England. Your village has maybe 60 people, and you have been sick since Tuesday. What happens next is not what you think. The story of medieval illness is almost never told honestly. Most versions reach straight for the grotesque, the bleeding, the leeches, the prayers to obscure saints. But underneath all of that was something considerably more complicated. And in at least one documented case, something that a modern laboratory tested against one of the most dangerous bacteria in the world and found genuinely remarkable. We will get to that. The first thing you do is nothing. That sounds like passivity. But it wasn't. Medieval people lived close enough to illness to understand that most fevers broke within 3 days. A bad cold, a stomach upset, a headache from bad air near the river, you waited because waiting was often the correct response. The body's immune system was doing what it always does, and people had enough accumulated experience to know that intervention wasn't always necessary or helpful. Rushing to treat a self-limiting illness was not wisdom, it was waste. If the fever didn't break by day 3, the calculus changed. The word doctor existed in the Middle Ages, but what it meant depended entirely on where you were standing. University-trained physicians, men who had studied at Bologna, Paris, or Montpellier for up to 14 years, were real. They were also rare, expensive, and primarily served wealthy households, cathedral chapters, and royal courts. A peasant in a village 40 miles from the nearest town would never see one in his lifetime. Even most urban craftsmen couldn't afford a consultation. These men charged fees that represented weeks of ordinary wages, and they knew it, and they adjusted their clientele accordingly. What most people had instead was layered. Think of it less like a single medical system and more like concentric rings of knowledge, each one accessible depending on your location, your illness, and what you could pay or offer in trade. The outermost ring, available to almost everyone, was domestic. Women in medieval households were expected to manage minor illness as part of running a home, the same way a modern household keeps a medicine cabinet and its own accumulated sense of when something is serious enough for a doctor. Herbal knowledge passed through generations, accumulated across centuries of observation, refined by failure and confirmed by success. Your mother knew things. Her mother had known things before her. That chain of knowledge was longer than any individual life, and it was not trivial. She probably didn't call herself a healer. The women who held this role in medieval villages carried no official title and no certification from any institution. What they had was accumulated knowledge, reputation, and consistent demand. When someone was sick, when a child had a cough that wasn't clearing, when a wound was showing early signs of going bad, you sent for her. Sometimes she arrived without being asked, because she had already heard. The church had complicated feelings about this arrangement. Official ecclesiastical medicine existed in parallel. Monasteries ran hospitals, cathedral schools produced and copied medical texts, church councils periodically debated the proper boundaries of medical practice. Unofficial female healers existed in a gray zone between all of this. Some were tolerated for decades. Some were periodically accused of using improper methods. The line between botanical knowledge and what church authorities called magic was drawn inconsistently and often had more to do with local politics than actual practice. Being accused had less to do with what you did and more to do with whether you had made enemies. What these healers used was overwhelmingly botanical. Willow bark for pain and fever, the same compound, salicin, that would later be isolated and synthesized into aspirin in the 19th century. Garlic as an antimicrobial, centuries before anyone understood what antimicrobial meant. Honey on wounds, which modern research has confirmed carries genuine antibacterial properties due to its hydrogen peroxide content and low moisture environment. Yarrow to slow bleeding. Elderflower for inflammation. Feverfew for headaches severe enough to disable. These weren't random superstitions collected from nowhere. They were the distilled result of centuries of observation across populations. What we would now call empirical testing at scale without the controlled conditions or the paperwork. People tried things. The things that worked got passed on. The things that reliably failed got quietly dropped, or attached to conditions narrow enough that failure could be explained away. The ones that caused obvious harm eventually disappeared from the record, which itself tells you something. There was a record. There was a system. Someone was paying attention. The methodology was completely different from a modern clinical trial. The impulse driving it was identical. The theoretical framework underlying formal medieval medicine would strike a contemporary physician as almost poetic in its wrongness. Humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, refined through Arabic scholarship, and transmitted to medieval Europe through translations made in Toledo and Sicily during the 10th and 11th centuries, held that the body contained four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health was their balance. Illness was their disruption. Your symptoms told the trained physician which humor had fallen out of alignment, and treatment followed logically from diagnosis. Yellow bile in excess caused fever and irritability. Phlegm in excess produced cold symptoms and sluggishness. Black bile caused melancholy and digestive complaints. Blood in excess caused, well, you can see exactly where the bloodletting came from and why it persisted for so long. If the framework was correct, the treatment was rational. This is what's worth sitting with before dismissing it. The system was internally consistent. If you accepted the premises, the treatments made sense. The problem was not the reasoning, but the model it was built on, which was simply wrong about how bodies function at a mechanical level. Medieval physicians were not stupid. They were working from bad source material. The difference matters. What humoral theory also generated, somewhat accidentally, was useful lifestyle guidance. Diet, sleep, exercise, air quality, and emotional state were all treated as part of health management. Physicians spoke of the 6 non-naturals: air, food and drink, sleep and waking, movement and rest, bodily evacuations, and passions of the soul as the primary levers of health. Every one of those categories maps directly onto what contemporary medicine calls lifestyle factors. The underlying explanation was wrong. The practical emphasis was largely right. If you were sick enough to travel, the monastery was your best option. Medieval monasteries were the most technologically sophisticated institutions in Europe between roughly 600 and 1200 CE. They kept libraries, they copied texts, they ran the scriptoria that preserved Greek and Arab medical knowledge through centuries when that knowledge would otherwise have been lost entirely. And they ran hospitals, real functioning medical wards, as a matter of religious obligation, not optional charity. The Rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century, instructed monks explicitly to care for the sick as if caring for Christ himself. Monastic infirmaries occupied separate buildings from the main community, had their own water supplies, and were staffed by monks who had read more medical literature than anyone outside a university. Herb gardens grown specifically for medicinal use were standard features of established monasteries throughout Western Europe by the 9th century. Hildegard of Bingen is the figure worth naming here. A Benedictine abbess writing in the 12th century, she produced two major medical texts, Physica and Causae et Curae, documenting hundreds of plants, their properties, and their applications. Her botanical observations were specific in ways that suggest direct clinical experience rather than copying from earlier sources. She was also wrong about much of the theoretical framework surrounding her observations. Both things were true at once, which is exactly the condition in which medicine has always operated. Even the least medically sophisticated monastery offered something the village could not: clean water, regular food, a fire through the night, and consistent human attention. In the context of medieval illness, that combination was not a small thing. It was frequently the margin between recovery and death. Here is the part nobody tells you. In 2015, a team of researchers at the University of Nottingham decided to test a remedy from a 9th century Anglo-Saxon medical text called Bald's Leechbook. The recipe targeted an eye infection, specifically something that matches the description of a stye, which can be caused by Staphylococcus aureus bacteria. The remedy called for equal amounts of garlic and onion, or leek, wine, and ox bile salts, mixed in a brass vessel and left to stand for 9 days before use. They made it. Following the original instructions as closely as modern materials allowed, then they tested it against MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, one of the most dangerous antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the modern hospital system, responsible for thousands of deaths each year in countries with sophisticated healthcare infrastructure. The medieval remedy killed approximately 90% of MRSA cells in laboratory conditions. The researchers were careful not to overclaim. A laboratory result is not a clinical result, and the finding has not yet translated into a new treatment protocol. But it was real and reproducible. It pointed at something important. Medieval healers, working without any concept of bacterial infection, without microscopes, without any understanding of what was actually happening inside infected tissue, had identified a combination of ingredients with genuine antimicrobial properties. They identified it through centuries of observation, careful record-keeping, and the empirical logic of their own tradition. Bald's Leechbook is not a curiosity. It is a clinical record. Someone tried these things. Someone wrote down the results carefully enough that the results survived 1,000 years and proved testable. The manuscript was passed on because it had demonstrated value, not because it was old. Surgery existed. This surprises people more than it probably should. Medieval surgeons, deliberately distinct from university-trained physicians who considered manual procedures beneath their academic dignity, performed a range of operations from the practical to the genuinely complex. Wound treatment, fracture setting, abscess drainage, arrowhead extraction. Trepanation, drilling into the skull, had been practiced since prehistory and continued through the medieval period, primarily for head injuries and severe persistent headaches. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries shows healed trepanation sites with fully remodeled bone, which means patients survived the procedure and continued living for years afterward. The absence of anesthesia is what troubles modern readers most. Medieval surgeons used what they had. Preparations called dwale, combining mandrake root, henbane, hemlock, and other sedating compounds, were applied or inhaled before procedures. These were not safe. Dosing was imprecise, and the margin between sedation and fatal overdose was narrow. Some patients did not wake up. But the attempt was consistently made, which means medieval practitioners had understood unconsciousness during surgery as a goal worth pursuing at significant risk. Speed was the other anesthetic. A surgeon who could amputate a limb in under 2 minutes, documented in multiple accounts of military surgery from the period, was not being careless. He was being merciful. The faster the procedure, the shorter the traumatic shock, the higher the odds of survival. This was skill, not brutality. What medieval surgery lacked almost entirely was antisepsis. Wounds became infected. Post-operative infection killed people who had survived the initial procedure. This was not ignorance of cleanliness as a concept. Hands were washed, instruments were sometimes cleaned with wine or vinegar, both of which carry mild antiseptic properties. The problem was not knowing why infection happened. Without germ theory, systematic prevention was structurally impossible. It wasn't a failure of attention, it was a failure of available knowledge. And that is a different kind of failure entirely. Medieval people knew something else without being able to explain it. Some diseases spread from person to person. They had no germ theory, they had no concept of contagion in the modern sense, but they had eyes and they had centuries of recorded observation showing that certain illnesses moved through populations in patterns that correlated with contact. The practical response to this observation was quarantine, and it worked well enough that it has never stopped being used. Leprosy was managed through a system of formal exclusion that was simultaneously more humane and more brutal than its reputation suggests. Lepers were not simply driven out. In many regions, they underwent a specific ritual, sometimes called the separation ceremony, that legally and spiritually redefined their status. They received dedicated housing in leprosaria built outside city walls, alms, and in some cases, better guaranteed food than the village poor. They were also permanently excluded from ordinary social and economic life, which is a very heavy cost. But the quarantine logic was sound. Separate people with a visibly contagious condition and reduce transmission. Medieval authorities reached this conclusion without understanding why it worked. The word quarantine itself comes directly from this period. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, implemented a mandatory 30-day isolation period for ships arriving from plague-affected ports, later extended to 40 days. Quarantina, 40 days. The logic was empirical. Officials had observed that people who survived exposure without developing symptoms after a certain period were unlikely to be infectious. They had no idea what they were observing at a biological level. The intervention was nonetheless correct. This is the thread running through medieval medicine that modern accounts consistently miss. The absence of accurate theory did not prevent accurate observation. These were not the same thing. You would also pray. This requires understanding on its own terms, not dismissal. Medieval illness and religion were not separate categories with an area of overlap. They were the same category. The body existed in relationship with God. Illness was not random in the modern epidemiological sense. It had moral and spiritual dimensions that a secular framework can acknowledge intellectually, but never quite inhabit. This didn't mean every sick person believed they were being specifically punished. Medieval theology was more sophisticated than its popular reputation suggests. But recovery involved spiritual intervention as genuinely as it involved physical intervention. These were not competing explanations. They described different aspects of the same event. Saints functioned as specialists. Saint Roch for plague, Saint Blaise for throat ailments. His blessing of throats with cross candles is still practiced on February 3rd in many Catholic communities. Saint Apollonia for toothache. Pilgrimage to a shrine was a genuine medical act within the framework of how medieval people understood reality to work, not a desperate fallback after real medicine had failed. Thousands of documented healing accounts from medieval shrines survive, collected by the Church during canonization processes. Most can be explained as spontaneous remission, placebo effect, or conditions that resolved on their own timeline. Some remain genuinely difficult to categorize. What prayer also provided was a structure for managing fear. You were sick in a world with no antibiotics, no understanding of infection, and a real statistical possibility that this particular fever was the one that killed you. 1 in 3 children in medieval England died before age 5. Adults knew this number in the intimate way that comes from having watched it happen. The rituals of illness, The specific prayers, the candles, the invocations to specific saints for specific conditions gave people something purposeful to do with their terror. That psychological function was real, regardless of what one believes about the metaphysical one. Modern medicine is beginning to quantify the relationship between mental state and immune function. The placebo effect is measurable and substantial. Stress demonstrably affects healing rates. Medieval people had the mechanism entirely wrong. The instinct that mind and body were connected was right. Most people recovered. This is the thing the dramatic version of medieval medicine consistently obscures. It makes for a worse story, so it gets left out. The majority of sick people in the Middle Ages got better, not necessarily because of the physicians or the prayers or the botanical remedies. The immune system was doing most of the work, as it always has. But the framework built around illness, the community response, the botanical knowledge accumulated over generations, the careful attention that monks and healers and village women paid to the sick, meant that people were not simply left alone to survive or not by chance. The distance between medieval medicine and modern medicine is real and very large. Germ theory changed everything. Antibiotics changed everything after that. Sterile surgical technique, anesthesia, imaging technology, the randomized controlled trial. The gap between 1100 and now is not a gap you want to fall into personally. But the impulse driving medieval medicine, to observe carefully, to record what worked, to pass knowledge forward, to care for sick people as a collective act rather than an individual transaction. That impulse was identical to what drives medicine today. Bald's Leechbook and a modern pharmacology journal are not the same document. The people who compiled them were asking the same questions. The next time you take a medication without fully understanding its mechanism, trust a treatment because someone you respect recommended it, or let people take care of you because you're too sick to manage alone. You're doing something medieval people would recognize immediately. The tools are different. The vulnerability is exactly the same. If this kind of history is useful to you, if it changes how you see the present by showing you the past clearly, then you already know what this channel is trying to do. Your support is what makes it possible to keep going.